Today we're talking about emotional triggers, and I'm sure at some point in your life you yourself have been triggered, and I can give you an example of this so that you can maybe reflect on the times that you have been triggered. So an example can be when you're in an argument with someone or when you're fighting with someone, and in that moment you might feel a very strong and intense emotion starting to build up inside of you. And that's exactly what a trigger is. It's an intense emotional response, usually to a situation, a person, an event, even just a thought can actually trigger us. And so you might feel in those moments like you're out of control and like that emotion kind of just consumes you and it takes over you. And in those moments when we are triggered, what often happens is we end up saying things we don't mean, we might do things we don't mean, and then we might end up regretting it. And so it's very important to understand what these triggers are, where they come from, and how you can process them so that you can avoid this happening over and over again. Because the more that we ignore those repressed feelings, the more it builds up, and then it just continues to show up in our lives. One key thing that we need to understand about emotional triggers is that a lot of the time the reaction that we are having is coming from a place of pain, and it's coming from a place of maybe repressed emotions that we aren't even aware of from a previous situation. Different things and different situations will trigger different people, right? Because this will vary from person to person depending on your own experiences in life. So your own childhood memories, childhood traumas, relationship issues, work stress, financial stress, whatever it is that has affected you personally is what will trigger you. And so what triggers you might not trigger me, right? And so it's important for us to all introspect and become self-aware of our own triggers. And usually the only way that we can really become aware of our triggers is unfortunately when we are triggered. A lot of the time you can do your own healing, and if you're in therapy or if you have a coach, then you can uncover a lot of those pain points within yourself so that you don't end up getting triggered. But unfortunately, a lot of the ways that we end up finding out about our triggers is through the experience of actually being triggered. And so what happens on a physiological level is that your body is responding to this situation, this person, or this event, basically in the same way that it has previously responded to a previous situation or event. So in this moment, this intense emotion comes up and it often takes over you. And then from that position, because we are so emotional, what often happens is our body goes into fight or flight mode. So this is a survival mode or a defense mode because we might feel emotionally threatened. So this isn't happening on a conscious level, right? You won't be in an argument and think to yourself, oh, I'm being triggered because of something that happened in my previous relationship and because of my insecurities. No, that's not often how it happens, right? What happens is we reacting. We are so caught up in that reaction that we aren't even aware of the fact that we've been triggered until we reflect on it afterwards. So that is basically where we start. We start by becoming aware of our triggers. And what this means is that we have to reflect, we have to introspect. So when you have been triggered, you can look at that situation, try to almost take a step back. If you can take a step back in the moment that you are being triggered, kudos to you, because that does take a lot of self-awareness. If you aren't able to take a step back in that moment that you are being triggered, afterwards, after you've been triggered, take a step back. Try to observe the situation. Bring your attention to what exactly came up for you. What emotion was it? What thoughts were running through your head? And a lot of the time we can look at that strong emotional response and we can tie it back to something that has happened previously. We can look at the underlying thoughts behind that reaction. What was I thinking at that point in time? We can look at, has this happened before? Is this maybe something from my past that is being brought up for me? Because that is the way that I kind of see an emotional trigger. This is just an opportunity for you to look at the parts of yourself that are not yet healed. So the parts of yourself that are still in pain. And this can be, like I mentioned, for a variety of reasons. And, it's not your fault. It's not your fault what happened to you. It's not your fault that you're being triggered necessarily. But it is your responsibility now to heal those parts of you that are still in pain. And that pain is now continuing into your present moment. And if it's not healed, it might even continue into your future, because if we don't deal with our underlying pain, if we don't deal with our triggers, they will resurface, because that is kind of, the process of healing. We want to be healed, intuitively. Our own evolution, our own personal growth can only happen if we become aware of these things. And so this is what happens when people repress and suppress their emotional pain. It does come up again, it does resurface again in other relationships, in other situations, because we haven't dealt with it. And so it's key that we process these emotional triggers so that they stop reappearing in our lives. And again, it starts with that awareness. So once you've assessed your trigger and you've looked at maybe other situations, beliefs, thought patterns, external people maybe who have contributed to that being a trigger, you can start to heal it. So with mindfulness, with therapy, there's different ways of dealing with your emotional triggers. But the biggest key is to become aware of it so that you can see that you're just repeating a pattern, and that this situation might not necessarily mean what you think it means in that emotional moment, right? So you might just be projecting something from the past into your present moment. The more we become aware of it, the more easily we can then work through that emotional pain and start to release it. So Michael Singer is one of my favorite authors, and he has written this book called The Untethered Soul. And he has a metaphor for emotional triggers where he says that an emotional trigger is basically the same thing as a thorn that has been lodged in your skin. So I'm sure if you've ever had a thorn in your skin, you'll know that it's an extremely uncomfortable and painful experience, right? And so as part of this metaphor, he explains that when a thorn gets lodged in your skin, you're going to experience that pain and discomfort until you take the thorn out, right? And it's the very same thing with an emotional trigger. An emotional trigger is like a thorn, and unless we remove that, unless we look at it and we bring awareness to it, that pain will continue to fester and it will continue to disturb us until we remove the thorn and heal that trigger. We go through this process of healing by bringing awareness to the underlying thoughts, the underlying beliefs that are beneath that emotional trigger. And again, we can look at our past experiences, we can look at our emotional reactions, those deeply, deeply painful and uncomfortable moments in our lives. And again, if it is that uncomfortable and that painful, then it would be better to do this in a therapy space. We can always heal our emotional triggers if we have that ability to introspect, to self-reflect, to be compassionate with ourselves as we go through this process, because it's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to look at those parts of ourselves that are still very much in pain and that are coming to the surface to be healed. And in that process of mindfulness, it really is about just observing your thoughts and your emotions objectively. So you'll just observe your thoughts and emotions without judgment. Okay, so you're not gonna give it any meaning. You're not gonna say this is a bad feeling. It's just an emotion. And I've heard this before, but they say that an emotion is just energy in motion. So you're just a vessel in which this emotion is passing through. And as a human, we're going to have a variety of experiences. We're going to have a variety of emotions. And it's important to embrace those emotions as they arise, because if we hold on to them, that's when we end up kind of getting stuck in that process. So healing our emotional triggers is really about that combination of self-awareness, self-compassion, and then seeking that guidance and support if we do need it. So if you feel like you can't deal with your emotional triggers on your own, that's totally fine. It's okay to get that support from a coach, from a therapist, that can also help you to kind of unpack those triggers and what it's rooted in, so that you can ultimately release it and heal it. Okay, so just be patient with yourself and approach your triggers with an open mind, with curiosity rather than judgment. Okay, so you don't want to beat yourself up about the fact that you're being triggered. You just want to understand that it's okay, it's coming from a place of pain, and I can heal that pain. And once we become aware of it and we release it, that is how we can start to heal from these emotional triggers, and then they'll stop presenting themselves in our lives. So I hope this helped you, and let me know what your experience is with your emotional triggers. Let me know maybe what your experience has been in healing them, or maybe what your struggles are, and we can continue the conversation in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.